October, there were a number of infiltrations into Kupiansk. I mean, there were individual Russians that engaged in acts of perfidy. They put on civilian clothing. They got to a particular area deep into Kupiansk. They took off the clothing, threw up a Russian flag, were killed or captured almost immediately, or they crawled through a sewer pipe to basically teleport into the middle of Kupiansk, take a picture with a flag, and then a bunch of people, and ISW did this too. I mean, we didn't have a methodology to deal with this at the time, but we're like, all right, well, there's a Russian there. Clearly, we think it's an assessed infiltration mission, so they don't exercise control. But a lot of folks would sort of same color red they paint Mariupol over in 2025. That's the same color red they'll paint Kupiansk over, and that's a problem.
January. January, for me, because this relates to what's going on today, the siege of Kupiansk began. Russian forces launched a massive multi-pronged offensive to seize the Kupiansk Vozlovye rail hub, and Ukrainian forces utilised an active defence, trading space for time while inflicting heavy armour losses against the advancing Russian columns. The Russians were using armour then, they're not now. January, how significant was that, or have you got something that you would rather focus on?
No, I mean, it's interesting because over the course of 2025, we've really seen the maturation of the positional character of this war. And we've seen the maturation of what we call the pointless frontline, which is that the drone kill zone is so aggressive and it's become so aggressive. And the drone operators and the tactics have been honed to the point where both sides are really effectively denying each other's use of mechanized vehicles at scale. There are some countermeasures, and the Ukrainians are actually developing some countermeasures, but it's very interesting. If you look at the battlefield in late 2024 or even mid 2024, you still would see armored vehicles used in combat occasionally in bits and spurts. And then by the time you get to mid 2025, it's essentially all infantry, small infantry group infiltrations. The mode and method for land warfare had completely changed, especially for offensive maneuver. And I think in January, we're still seeing sort of vestigial armor attacks here and there. But that would later go on to evolve and bring us to the changes that occurred throughout the rest of the year.
In December of this year, and Pokrovsk is still holding. Kupiansk is even more interesting because we had Vladimir Putin turn around and say that it had been taken and completely captured by the Russians. The general that was responsible for it was given a big medal. Putin said he'd take the international press in to see it. And then 2 weeks later, Zelensky is standing there in front of the Kupiansk sign, taking a selfie, saying, you haven't got it, and we've got 90% of it back. A fascinating period of time.
Yeah. So the December stuff in Kupiansk was a culmination of at least 3 months of campaigning. Because we went back and we looked at the data for all the things that we could collect and gather over Kupiansk, and actually the Russian sources had been reporting Ukrainian counterattacks of the nature of which we saw the culmination of all throughout December up to that point, including into November. And then in November, and I think even late October, we started to see the reports that the Ukrainians were saying, we've severely degraded the Russian logistics in Kupiansk. We have been interdicting their supply lines with drones and artillery. And so there was a real shaping effort that took place in the weeks and months leading up to the decisive counterattack where the Ukrainians actually conducted a mechanized attack. I mean, I don't want to overblow it because it was a relatively small mechanized attack, but they did succeed in getting, the Hartia guys managed to successfully get armored vehicles to help cut off the northern part of the city. And that's actually, I think, very promising and very, very impressive. That shows what a well-provisioned, well-trained, brigade or division can do when they've properly planned everything correctly, and the Russians have overstretched themselves. I mean, there are places where these sort of you get the right combination of all the factors, and it leads to a success. And it was a major success. But what I also showed was another thing which is interesting, which is some reflections I made about how we mapped this war from the open source. We used to have a methodology, and by we I mean the open source intelligence, cartography community, where if you saw a Russian ground presence in a particular place and you could geolocate it, that is determined that it certainly happened there, that would become a vertice in your line for where you would draw the front line of own troops for the Russians. The Russians caught on to that, and they started to metagame the methodology for how many folks were making these maps. And so then what they started to do was have Russians deploy forward with flags, and their mission was to actually go to a contested location that the Russians certainly don't control, raise a flag so that our drone can take a picture of you ostentatiously waving a flag at a known landmark. You might get killed or captured. That's inconsequential. But what will happen is this will go on the internet, and then we will put this forward as the putative evidence that the Russians exercise control over large swaths of new terrain because you have successfully infiltrated, that's what infiltrators do. And so in October, there were a number of infiltrations into Kupiansk. I mean, there were individual Russians that engaged in acts of perfidy. They put on civilian clothing. They got to a particular area deep into Kupiansk. They took off the clothing, threw up a Russian flag, were killed or captured almost immediately, or they crawled through a sewer pipe to basically teleport into the middle of Kupiansk, take a picture with a flag. And then a bunch of people, and ISW did this too. I mean, we didn't have a methodology to deal with this at the time, but we're like, all right, well, there's a Russian there. Clearly, we think it's an assessed infiltration mission, so they don't exercise control. But a lot of folks would sort of, same color red they paint Mariupol over in 2025, that's the same color red they'll paint Kupiansk over, and that's a problem. So what we did in early November is, recognizing this, we started to map infiltration areas separate of the areas where we think the Russians have conducted frontal attacks into, and separate of the areas where they think they actually exercise control.
And this is where, if the Russians had done that, they wouldn't have that strategic effect of embarrassing Vladimir Putin by declaring they'd captured somewhere. So, very, very briefly, do you see much of a change in 2026?
The war will likely continue. There's this peace process thing, and everyone's talking about the peace process thing. But look, the Russians have made it very clear that they're not willing to, that they're not going to favorably look at any sort of agreement that is not a capitulation to Russia. They reject the concept of Ukraine receiving security guarantees. They demand that the Ukrainians cede over, large swaths of strategically vital territory that the Russians don't control, and are not likely to seize with at least another 2.5 years, 3 years of warfighting. So I think that's at a little bit of an impasse. The most dangerous course of action is, of course, the United States repeats what it did back in February, March of 24, which is, all right, we're cutting you off, enjoy your war, which would be very bad. It would be very, very, very bad. But this war, I don't see it coming to an end anytime particularly soon, in my humble judgment.
You've been watching Times Radio Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. Now, if you want more on the war in Ukraine, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for membership to get you exclusive content and allow you to ask questions back to me. And remember, Frontline is also available in podcast form. You can listen to us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Times Radio Frontline.